Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 15 of my historical travel podcast, Voyage to Go History, where I take you on the most adventurous journeys from the past that continue to shape our view of the world today. In this true story, 17-year-old German Georg Forster travels around the world with his father, a naturalist in the 18th century, aboard a sailing ship under the command of James Cook. Georg's travel narrative is written in the language of the 18th century. To make it more understandable, I have largely translated it into modern language. His knowledge is that of the late 18th century, so I will place some of his statements in context and provide additional information. What happened in the last episode?
In the last episode, the crew of the HMS Resolution ventured deep into Dusky Bay, navigating dramatic landscapes, hunting expeditions, and first contact with elusive locals. After a failed duck hunt due to wet firearms, Captain Cook pushed through tangled wilderness and returned triumphantly with water hens. Over the next days, they explored hidden bays and mountains, camped under the stars, and gathered rare birds and plants, despite relentless rain and biting sandflies. A solemn moment occurred when a local man performed a ritual with a green branch and speech before boarding the ship, signaling peace. He and the girl who accompanied him marveled at European wonders, from goats to hammocks, while offering flax textiles and even a fragrant oil gift, though not everyone appreciated the scent. Later, the crew encountered more locals. Peace was formally established with the symbolic gift of a grass blade and the exchange of cloaks and axes. But behind this fragile friendship lurked signs of potential conflict. Despite having received many valuable gifts, the local man left abruptly, hinting that he would use the iron tools for war. This cast doubt on the crew's hopes of spreading agriculture and peace, and reminded them of the fierce independence and warlike traditions of New Zealand's scattered families.
Friday, April 23rd, 1773, Dusky Bay, New Zealand.
In the morning, several officers, along with Dr. Sparman, went to Cascade Bay to climb one of the highest mountains in the entire bay. At 2 o'clock, they reached the summit and signaled their success by lighting a large fire. They would have liked to accompany them, but diarrhea and colic kept them confined to the ship. Both ailments were caused by the cook's negligence, who had allowed their copper cookware to become entirely covered in verdigris. By evening, however, they felt well enough to go meet their walking companions on the way back from Cascade Bay, and later returned on board together with various plants and birds. Meanwhile, the fire lit on the mountain summit had caught the surrounding brush and spread into a ring of flames around the peak, making for a beautiful illumination in honor of today's St. George's Day. The group who had climbed there said they could see the entire bay and the sea beyond the mountains, to the south, southwest, and northwest, for more than 74 kilometers or 46 miles in every direction, thanks to the bright and clear weather that day. The inland mountains seemed very barren, as they consisted of massive, rugged rock formations and were snow-covered at the top. But on the summit of the mountain they had climbed, there was various low shrubbery and alpine plants not found anywhere else. A bit further down grew taller bushes, and lower still, they found an area where all the trees had died and fallen. Then a green forest began, growing taller and more beautiful the further down they went. Climbing up had been exhausting because of tangled vines and thorny plants. Descending was dangerous because of steep ravines. They mostly had to slide down and grab onto trees and bushes for support. Quite high up the mountain, they found 3 or 4 trees that seemed to be palms. They cut down one and used the central shoot as a refreshing snack. But in fact, these trees didn't belong to the true cabbage palms, and not even to the palm family at all, since palms grow only in milder climates. Rather, they were a new kind of dragon tree with broad leaves, the Dracaena australis, of which the group later found several more in the bay. The central shoot, as long as it was still tender, tasted somewhat like an almond kernel, though with a hint of cabbage.
Saturday, April 24th, 1773, Dusky Bay, New Zealand.
The next morning, Georg accompanied Captain Cook to a bay on the northwestern side of the inlet, which, because of what they planned to do there, was called Goose Bay. They still had 5 live geese left from the ones taken at the Cape of Good Hope, and they intended to leave them in New Zealand, hoping they would multiply and turn wild. This bay seemed the most suitable for that purpose, since there were no inhabitants, but plenty of food. So they released the birds on the shore, and for the benefit of future sailors and settlers in New Zealand, spoke over them the words, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." As soon as the geese were on land, they began foraging in the mud, and would no doubt thrive in this remote corner, hopefully spreading across the entire country over time, just as they had intended. They spent the rest of the day shooting birds, and, among others, shot a white heron, the Ardea alba, which was common in Europe. The fine weather, which had lasted for a full 8 days in a row, came to an end on the 25th. It began to rain in the evening and continued non-stop until the following midday. Most likely, such long stretches of good weather were rare in Dusky Bay, especially during this season. At least it had never stayed fine for 2 days straight, either before or after this period. They had planned ahead and used that time to replenish their supply of wood and water and to prepare the ship again for sailing. All their men returned on board. The bridge was dismantled, and they moved from their sheltered corner out into the middle of the bay, ready to set sail with the next favorable wind. Nothing made the advantages of a civilized society over the raw state of nature clearer than the changes and improvements that had been made at that spot. In just a few days, a small number of their men had cleared wood from more than half a hectare of land, something 50 Maori, using only stone tools, would not have achieved in 3 months. They had transformed a barren and wild patch, where countless plants once grew and withered in neglect, into a lively space where 120 men were constantly engaged in various tasks. They felled timber that would have eventually fallen and rotted on its own from age and decay, and their sawyers cut planks from it or chopped it into firewood. Nearby, by a rushing stream, whose outlet into the sea they had improved, stood the cooper's workspace, whole rows of new or repaired barrels ready to be filled with water. Not far from there, a large kettle steamed, where a healthy and tasty drink for the workers was brewed from local plants, previously considered useless. Close by, their men cooked excellent fish for their crewmates, some of whom were working along the ship's outer hull and mast to clean, caulk, and repair the rigging. These various tasks filled the scene with activity and sounds, while the nearby mountain echoed with the rhythmic blows of the smith's hammers. Even the fine arts flourished in this new colony. A beginner in the craft, Georg Forster sketched the various animals and plants of these untouched forests during his apprenticeship. The romantic landscapes of the wild, rugged land, however, stood vividly captured in the glowing colors of creation, and nature seemed almost astonished to see itself so faithfully mirrored on the artist's, Mr. Hodges' canvas. Even the higher sciences had graced this remote wilderness with their presence. Amid the mechanical workshops, an observatory rose, equipped with the best instruments, through which the astronomer's tireless watch recorded the movement of the stars. The plants the soil produced and the wonders of the animal kingdom in forests and lakes occupied the scholars, whose hours were devoted to discovering their differences and uses. In short, wherever they looked, the arts seemed to blossom, and science shone in a land that until then had been covered by a long night of ignorance and barbarity. But this beautiful vision of elevated humanity and nature was not to last. Like a meteor, it vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. They brought their instruments and tools back aboard the ship and left no trace of their stay behind, except for a patch of land that had been stripped of its trees. True, they had scattered a variety of European garden seeds of the finest kind there, but the surrounding weeds would soon choke every useful plant, and in a few years the place where they had stayed would no longer be recognizable, reduced again to the land's original chaotic state. Sic transit gloria mundi. Moments or centuries of cultivation make no noticeable difference when faced with the consuming force of the future.
In Dusky Bay, modern-day visitors can still find physical traces of Captain Cook's second voyage to New Zealand in 1773. One of the most well-known is the engraved inscription Resolution Cove, carved into a rock at Pickersgill Harbour, where Cook anchored the HMS Resolution for several weeks. This site served as a base for repairs, water collection, and scientific observations. The cove itself was named after the ship, and nearby Astronomer's Point is where the expedition set up a temporary observatory and forge, essential installations for navigation and maintenance. Remnants of this camp are still visible today. Visitors can find the leveling platform used for the observatory and evidence of tree felling in the area. Additionally, a bronze plaque marks the spot of Cook's landfall. These features, along with Cook's detailed maps and journal entries, have made Dusky Sound an important historical site, now part of Fiordland National Park and the Te Wahiponamu UNESCO World Heritage Area. Though remote and difficult to access, the bay remains a quiet witness to one of the most significant moments of maritime exploration in the South Pacific.
Before Georg left this place of their recent stay, he wanted to include the following astronomical notes from Captain Cook's journal. The observatory they had set up in Pickersgill Harbor lay at 45 degrees, 47 minutes, 26.5 seconds south latitude and 166 degrees, 18 minutes east longitude from Greenwich. Here it turned out that Kendall's longitude watch gave a result 1 degree, 48 minutes less than the actual longitude, while Arnold's gave only 39 minutes, 25 seconds less than the true value. At the Cape of Good Hope, Kendall's watch had astonishingly indicated the correct longitude to within 1 minute, just as Messrs. Mason and Dixon had observed and calculated it astronomically. However, it should be noted that these timepieces did not always run consistently, and that was why observations had to be made at each place they anchored to determine their real performance. The large deviation found in Dusky Bay was partly due to the assumption that Kendall's watch constantly showed mean time, whereas at the Cape it had already been found that this was no longer the case. The astronomer, Mr. Wales, now observed that Kendall's watch gained 6.461 seconds daily over mean time, while Arnold's, which tended to vary more, lost 99.361 seconds per day.
In the 18th century, one of the greatest challenges in navigation was determining a ship's longitude at sea. While latitude could be found relatively easily by observing the sun or stars, longitude required knowing the precise time and a fixed location, usually Greenwich in England. By comparing this reference time with the local time, calculated by the sun's position, navigators could determine how far east or west they were. But this required an extremely accurate clock that could withstand the movement and conditions at sea. Two of the most important timekeepers of the era were the marine chronometers made by John Arnold and Larcom Kendall. Kendall's K1, a copy of John Harrison's revolutionary H4 chronometer, was the first reliable sea clock used extensively on long voyages. Captain James Cook took the K1 on his second voyage aboard the HMS Resolution and praised its performance, noting that it allowed for unprecedented precision in navigation. Arnold, a contemporary and sometimes rival of Kendall, also developed chronometers that improved in accuracy and affordability over time, contributing significantly to maritime navigation. These chronometers marked a breakthrough. They allowed ships to determine longitude accurately for the first time in history, transforming sea and travel exploration. Before their invention, navigational errors often led to shipwrecks and lost cargo. With reliable timepieces, voyages became safer and mapping the world's oceans more precise. In the broader context of measurement and mapping, the names Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon are also important. These two English surveyors were commissioned in the 1760s to resolve a boundary dispute between the British colonies in America. Their work established the Mason-Dixon line, which originally divided Pennsylvania and Maryland, but later became famous as the symbolic divide between the northern and southern United States, especially in the context of slavery and the Civil War. Thursday, May 27, 1773, Dusky Bay.
Today they discovered a new outlet to the sea, toward the north. Since it was easier to pass through than the one by which they had entered the bay, they planned to use it and raise the anchor on the afternoon of May 29th to sail up the bay in that direction. But suddenly the wind died down, so they had to anchor again in 79 meters, about 259 feet, of water on the north side of an island they named Long Island, about 3.7 kilometers, approximately 2.3 miles, from the bay where they had previously been anchored. The next morning, at 9 a.m., they set out again with a light west wind, but the wind was so weak that they could hardly make progress against the current. Even with all their boats towing the ship, they had managed to cover only about 9 kilometers, approximately 5.6 miles, by 6 p.m., with great effort. So at that time, they had to drop anchor again at the same island, about 100 paces from the shore. At daybreak, they tried to tack against the wind, since a gentle breeze was blowing down the bay. But soon the air went completely calm, and the current pushed the ship backward. The stern drifted so close to a vertical cliff, where there was no anchorage, that the flagstaff became tangled in the branches of nearby trees. However, with the help of their boats, they were towed away without damage and dropped anchor again, this time just below the spot where they had anchored the night before, in a small cove on the north side of Long Island. There they found 2 huts and some fireplaces, suggesting that the place had been inhabited not long ago. During their stay in this bay, they discovered several new birds and fish, including some European species like the jack mackerel and 2 types of spotted and smooth dogfish. The captain fell ill with a fever and severe back pain, which eventually led to a rheumatic swelling in his right foot. This was likely caused by all the time he had spent wading through water, then sitting still in the boat with wet clothes. After being stuck in this bay until the afternoon of June 4th, due to calm winds and constant rain, a light breeze finally rose from the southwest. With its help, they barely reached the passage to the open sea when the wind shifted again and began blowing against them. As a result, they had to drop anchor once more on the eastern side of the entrance, in front of a sandy shore. This repeated delay gave them a chance to explore the coasts, and they never returned without new riches from the animal and plant kingdoms. At night, they endured heavy gusts of wind with rain, hail, snow, and even some loud thunderclaps. By dawn, the mountain peaks all around them were covered in snow. At 2 p.m., a gentle wind from the south-southwest rose, and with the help of their boats, they made it through the passage out to the open sea. There they dropped anchor at 8 p.m. near the outermost point of land. In the passage, the coasts on both sides were steeper than anything they had ever seen. The wild landscape views were decorated in places with countless waterfalls and many dragon trees. Since the captain wasn't allowed to leave the cabin due to his rheumatism, he sent an officer to explore the nearby sea arm that stretched southward and led from this new passage eastward into the interior of the land. Georg's father, as well as Georg himself, joined this expedition. While they were away, the captain ordered the entire ship to be cleaned between decks. Fires were lit in various places to purify and renew the air, a precaution that should never be neglected in a damp and rough climate. Meanwhile, the expedition rowed up this new inlet and enjoyed the beautiful waterfalls visible on both sides. They found good anchorages everywhere, as well as plenty of fish and wild birds. The forest, however, made mostly of shrubs, had begun to look barren. Most of the leaves had already fallen, and the ones still on the branches looked wilted and pale yellow. These signs of the approaching winter were particularly noticeable in this part of the bay. Still, it was likely that the early wintry appearance was due to the proximity of the high mountains, which were already covered in snow. At 2 p.m., they turned into a bay to prepare a light lunch of fish. After eating, they rowed on until evening fell, planning to camp on a small flat shore near the far end of the sea arm. They lit a fire, but could hardly sleep because the night was very cold and their sleeping spots were very hard. The next morning they headed north into a small bay where this sea arm ended after a stretch of about 15 kilometers, approximately 9.3 miles. They spent some time shooting birds there and had just begun to return to the Resolution when the fine weather suddenly turned. A storm broke out from the northwest with strong gusts and heavy rain. They rowed back down the sea arm as quickly as possible. When they reached the entrance to the channel where the ship was anchored, they shared the last bit of a bottle of rum with the boat crew to lift their spirits, because the hardest part of the work still lay ahead of them. After this boost of courage, they pushed on bravely. But the waves, which could now roll in freely from the open sea, rose high and moved with frightening speed. The wind, no longer blocked by the land, was so strong that, despite all their efforts, they were pushed half a kilometer off course within minutes. In such dangerous conditions, they had to expect the boat to capsize or sink at any moment. Their greatest wish now was to get back into the sea arm they had so boldly left just before. With unimaginable effort, they finally managed to return, and around 2 p.m., entered a small, pleasant bay on its northern side. They secured the boat as best they could and prepared for lunch. To do this, they climbed a desolate cliff and lit a fire to cook some fish. But although they were soaked to the bone and freezing from the cutting wind, they couldn't stay close to the fire. It constantly flared and swirled from the storm, forcing them to change position again and again to avoid being burned. Eventually, the storm grew so violent that it became nearly impossible to stand upright on that fully exposed spot. They decided, for their own safety and the boat's, to seek shelter on the other side of the bay and set up their night camp in the woods. To that end, each person grabbed a burning stick, and in this terrifying state, they rushed to the boat. They could have been mistaken for a group of desperate people setting out on a hopeless mission. To their great dismay, they found the forest even worse than the cliff they had left behind. The ground was so wet that they could barely keep the fire alive. They had no shelter from the heavy rain, which poured down twice as hard through the trees, and since the smoke couldn't rise in the wind, they were nearly suffocated. There was no thought of dinner or warmth. They had to lie down, hungry and half frozen, wrapped in wet coats on the soaked ground. Miserable as the situation was, especially for those who had developed aching limbs from the cold, everyone was so exhausted that they fell asleep for a few moments. But around 2 in the morning, a loud thunderclap jolted them awake. By then, the storm had reached its peak and turned into a full-blown hurricane. It tore down the largest trees around them and slammed them to the ground with a terrifying crash. The roaring wind in the leafy treetops was so loud that the thunder of the waves could barely be heard. Fearing for their boat, they ventured toward the shore in the thick darkness. Then a flash of lightning lit up the entire sea arm, showing the towering waves crashing over each other in foaming blue walls. In short, all the elements seemed to threaten nature with total destruction. Immediately after, the lightning came the loudest thunderclap they had ever heard. Its long, terrifying rumble echoed sevenfold from the broken cliffs all around. They stood stunned, their hearts trembling at the thought that the storm or lightning might have destroyed the ship, and that they would be left behind in this desolate part of the world, doomed to perish. With such fearful thoughts, they spent the rest of the night, which seemed to them the longest of their lives. Finally, the storm subsided around 6 a.m., and as soon as daylight broke, they returned to the boat and soon after reached the ship. Luckily, it was still intact, though it had had to lower the yards and topmasts due to the storm. The sea arm where they had spent that dreadful night and soaked their coats was now charted and named Wet Jacket Arm. Only one last sea arm remained to be explored to the north of the previous one, and since Captain Cook had recovered well enough, he set out right after their return to take on this final task himself. About 16 kilometers, approximately 10 miles from the mouth, they could already see the far end of the arm. Just like the previous inlet, it offered good harbors, fresh water, wood, fish, and wild birds. On the way back, the men had to row against strong wind and heavy rain, and didn't return to the ship until 9 p.m., completely soaked. The next morning the sky was clear, but the wind remained against them. Since they couldn't leave the bay, Captain Cook decided to return to the new sea arm for bird hunting, and Georg's group went along. The hunt lasted all day and was quite successful. Meanwhile, some officers who had gone to a different area came back nearly empty-handed. Because the wind still blew hard from the west the next day, Captain Cook didn't consider it wise to set out to sea. Instead, in the afternoon, when the weather became a bit milder, he had himself taken to an island lying at the entrance of the channel where many seals were resting. With help from his crew, he shot 10 of them, but due to limited space, they could only bring 5 back on board and had to leave the rest behind for the time being. During the night, so much snow had fallen that by the next morning the mountains were nearly half covered, making it seem clear that winter had fully arrived. The sky was clear, but the air was sharp and cold. However, since the wind had turned favorable, the captain had the anchors lifted and sent out a boat to retrieve the seals left behind the day before. As soon as the animals were brought on board, they sailed out of Dusky Bay, and by midday found themselves fully in the open sea, far from land. They had now spent 6 weeks and 4 days in Dusky Bay. They constantly had an abundance of fresh food, worked diligently, and got plenty of exercise. All of this had undoubtedly contributed to the recovery of those who had shown signs of scurvy upon arrival, and to the strengthening of the rest of the crew. However, without the sprout beer, they likely wouldn't have remained so healthy and vigorous. The climate, to be honest, was not ideal. At least it couldn't be called healthy, since during their entire stay they had only experienced 1 continuous week of good weather, while for the rest of the time it had almost always rained. Still, this kind of weather likely harmed the British sailors less than it would have affected other nations, as the English were already accustomed to a generally damp climate from their homeland. Another downside of Dusky Bay was that it had neither wild celery, nor scurvy grass, nor any other antiscorbutic herbs, plants that were commonly found in Queen Charlotte Sound and other parts of New Zealand. No less unpleasant was the fact that the sandflies here were so troublesome, as their poisonous bites actually caused blister-like sores. Moreover, the entire area was covered in dense forest, completely overgrown and impenetrable. Finally, the mountains were terribly steep and therefore impossible to cultivate. However, these inconveniences, at least the last 2, were more of a burden to the local inhabitants than to the sailors, who only anchored here for a short time to recover. For such travelers, Dusky Bay, despite all these disadvantages, would always remain one of the best places of refuge, especially if they, like the crew, had spent a long time at sea without sight of land, under constant hardship. The entrance to the bay was safe, with no hidden danger that couldn't be seen from above the water. In addition, there were so many harbors and inlets that it was simply impossible to be in want of an anchoring spot where wood, water, fish, and wildfowl weren't found in abundance.
This concludes part 15 of Georg Forster's journey around the world aboard the HMS Resolution under the command of James Cook. I have linked a map of the locations of this episode in the show notes. For those who would like to see the locations of the journey around the world on the present day, I recommend my YouTube channel, Voyage to Go. There, I visit the places from Georg Forster's travel narrative and try to uncover traces and connections between today and the past. So that was episode 15 of our journey around the world, with Georg Forster, Captain Cook and the HMS Resolution, on which we will continue our travels together in the coming weeks. I hope we can travel a little further together, because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.